Ever get that feeling? Like,
Yeah.
you're going through a maze when you're dealing with insurance companies. Like, they're working from some kind of secret playbook.
Oh, yeah.
Well, today we're going to try to decode that playbook. We're diving deep into Jay Feinman's delay, deny, defend, not just to expose the tactics, but more importantly, to give you some tools to navigate the insurance world.
It's a real eye-opener, this book.
I've heard that.
Feinman, he doesn't just skim the surface. He really digs into the history of the insurance industry, the strategies they use, the systemic issues, all that stuff.
And we're specifically focusing on property and casualty insurance today, right?
Right. The kind that covers, your house, your car, the stuff that affects most people.
Yeah, the everyday stuff that can really turn your life upside down if something goes wrong.
Exactly. And what Feinman shows is fascinating. This whole industry, worth trillions of dollars, has really shifted its focus. Remember that old image of insurance, the good hands coming to your rescue?
Yeah, that was a classic.
Well, according to Feinman, it's become more like boxing gloves these days.
Boxing gloves. Okay, that's a pretty dramatic image. What caused that shift, according to Feinman?
He points the finger at McKinsey and Company, the big consulting firm.
Yeah.
They were the ones who advised major insurance companies like Allstate to get a lot more aggressive with their claims handling.
Basically saying, hey, focus on minimizing payouts. That's where the real money is.
Pretty much. Feinman actually breaks down this new approach into a 3-step strategy. Delay, deny, defend. First, they drag their feet, make the process as slow as possible, hoping you'll get tired, you get frustrated, and you'll just take whatever lowball offer they throw at you.
Makes sense. Wear the person down.
Right. And then even if your claim is totally valid, they'll often try to deny it.
Oh.
Using technicalities, twisting the language of the policy, things like that.
So it's like a loophole game.
Yeah, could say that.
Yeah.
And then finally, if you're stubborn, if you actually decide to sue, they come at you with everything they've got.
Hiring the best lawyers, dragging it out in court.
Exactly. Hoping you'll just give up.
So it sounds like their whole strategy is built on the idea that most people will just give in eventually. It's just too much hassle to fight.
That's certainly the cynical view. And Feinman backs it up with some pretty compelling evidence.
Like what?
Well, there's the story of Kim Zilish, for example. This woman, she got hit by an underinsured driver. Totally not her fault.
Oof, those are the worst.
Right. And she had to fight tooth and nail with State Farm for a whole year before they finally paid her what she was owed.
A year.
Yeah.
Just to get what she deserves.
A whole year. And that's just one example. Think how many people out there just accept whatever the insurance company offers them because they don't have the time, the energy, or the resources to fight back.
It's exhausting just thinking about it. I can see why Feinman calls it delay, deny, defend. But is it just about individual cases? Or is there something bigger going on here?
Oh, it's definitely bigger than that. Feinman digs into the systemic factors that are driving this profit-first mentality in the insurance industry. One of the key concepts he talks about is moral hazard.
Moral hazard. Isn't that like an economics term?
It is, but it plays a big role in insurance, too. The basic idea is that people who have insurance are more likely to take risk because they know they're covered.
So if I know my car is insured, I'm more likely to, drive recklessly?
Well, maybe not recklessly, but you might be a little less careful. And the insurance companies use this argument to justify stricter rules, higher rates, all sorts of things.
So they're basically saying, because you have insurance, you're more likely to have an accident, so we're going to charge you more.
It's a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, as Feinman points out.
Yeah, I can see that. But isn't there a ton of competition in the insurance industry? Doesn't that keep them in check?
There is competition. But according to Feinman, it's led to what he calls an advertising arms race.
An arms race.
Yeah, like a spending war. These companies spend billions of dollars on advertising, promising you the lowest rates.
Which we all love to see, right?
Sure, we love cheap insurance. But then, when it comes time to actually pay out on a claim, that's where they might start looking for ways to cut corners.
So it's like bait and switch. Low prices to lure you in, then making it hard to get what you paid for.
That's the dynamic Feinman describes. And it's not just the companies themselves. The tools and the processes they use have also changed. Take claims adjusters, for example.
The people who come out and assess the damage after an accident or whatever.
Exactly. Their role has changed a lot. They used to have a lot more freedom to make fair assessments based on their own judgment.
So they could actually be advocates for the policyholders sometimes.
Yeah, sometimes, yeah. But now, a lot of them are basically bound by these computer programs.
Computer programs.
Yeah. One of the most common ones is called Colossus.
Colossus. Sounds kind of ominous.
It is what it sounds like. It's basically a software program that estimates the value of a claim.
Okay, so it tries to take the guesswork out of it. Makes it more objective.
That's the idea. But as Feinman points out, these programs can be manipulated to generate really low numbers.
So they're using technology to, what, lowball people even more.
Essentially, yes.
This is starting to feel less like boxing gloves and more like a rigged game. Is there any hope for the average person?
Well, Feinman actually dedicates a big chunk of his book to addressing that very question. He offers a lot of practical advice, specific strategies that people can use. But before we get into that, there's one more type of claim I want to talk about. It's something Feinman calls missed claims.
Missed claims? What's that?
Stands for minor injury soft tissue. Think whiplash from a fender bender, that sort of thing.
Okay, so pretty common stuff. What's special about these claims?
They're often treated with a lot more suspicion than other types of claims.
Because?
Well, there's a perception that these injuries are subjective, hard to prove, maybe even exaggerated.
So they're assuming people are faking it to get a payout.
That's often the underlying assumption, yeah. And that justification gets used to really minimize payouts on these claims.
How so? What kind of tactics do they use?
Well, they might insist you go through a ton of medical examinations. Often with doctors they choose. Or they'll do something called a paper review.
Paper review.
Yeah, basically a physician just looks at your medical records and questions the need for treatment without even examining you in person.
So they're basically saying, we don't trust your doctor.
In a nutshell, yes. And if it goes to court, be prepared for a long and expensive fight. The insurance companies will often try to make the process as difficult as possible, hoping you'll eventually just give up.
It's a pretty bleak picture. It makes you wonder if insurance is even living up to its promise of protection anymore.
That's a really important question, and it's one we'll keep exploring as we dive deeper into Feinman's book. But before we shift gears and start talking about homeowners insurance, I'm curious, what's your biggest takeaway so far?
Honestly. It's just the realization that something that's supposed to be a safety net insurance can actually feel more like an obstacle course.
I think that's a very accurate observation. And that's exactly why it's so crucial to understand the system, understand the tactics they use, and understand your rights as a policyholder.
Well, let's talk about homeowners insurance then. Feinman really digs into those all-risk policies. And as he points out, they can be pretty misleading.
Oh, absolutely. The name itself is a bit of a trap, creates this illusion that you're covered for everything. But the reality is way more complicated. There are all these exclusions, limitations, hidden in the fine print.
So you think you're safe, you think you're protected, and then bam, something happens and you find out you're not covered at all.
Exactly. Take flooding, for example. Many homeowners policies don't cover flood damage, even if it's caused by a hurricane.
Which seems especially relevant after what happened with Hurricane Katrina. That's a big part of Feinman's book, right?
It is. Katrina was a perfect example of how insurance companies will use obscure clauses and questionable interpretations to avoid paying out on legitimate claims. There were widespread accusations that companies were downplaying the wind damage and blaming everything on flooding, which wasn't covered by most policies.
So even in a catastrophic situation, a national disaster, they're still looking for loopholes.
According to Feinman's analysis, yeah, some companies definitely were. And it's not just natural disasters either. He also talks about how the industry tends to really blow the issue of insurance fraud out of proportion.
You mean like they use the fear of fraud as an excuse to deny legitimate claims?
That's one of the tactics he exposes, yeah. They have these red flags they use to identify potentially fraudulent claims, but these flags can be so broad that even perfectly legitimate claims can get caught up in the net.
What kind of red flags are we talking about?
Oh, all sorts of things. Multiple occupants in a vehicle, subjective injuries like headaches or back pain. Even having the same doctor as other claimants can trigger a fraud investigation.
Even if there's no real evidence of wrongdoing?
Even then, yeah.
It sounds like they're just casting a really wide net, hoping to catch anything they can. And innocent people are getting swept up in the process.
It's a valid concern.
Yeah.
And it really highlights how important it is to be informed, to be proactive when you're dealing with insurance companies.
This is a lot to take in. And honestly, it's pretty disheartening. It makes you wonder, what can you actually do to protect yourself in this system?
That's the million-dollar question. And thankfully, Feinman dedicates a big chunk of his book to answering it. He lays out a bunch of practical advice, strategies you can use to fight back. And we'll dive into all that in the next part of our deep dive. I know it can feel kind of overwhelming, right? You're facing this whole massive industry that seems like it's designed to protect itself. But Feinman, he doesn't want to discourage people with this book. It's really meant to empower you.
Yeah, that's what we were getting into before, right? The whole what can you do part of this. Knowing the tactics is one thing, but actually, counteracting them, that's a whole different story.
Exactly. And what's surprising is that Feynman's advice is pretty straightforward. First and foremost, be informed, read your policy. I know it's tedious, but really try to understand it. The coverage, the exclusions, your rights as a policyholder. Don't just assume you're covered for everything.
Okay, easier said than done, right?
Yeah.
Insurance policies are famous for being written in, like ancient Greek.
True, but there are resources out there to help you decipher it all. Feinman, he actually includes a glossary in the book.
Oh, that's helpful.
And there are websites, consumer advocacy groups, they break it down in plain language. The important thing is to be proactive. Don't wait until something happens.
So step 1, learn the lingo. What's next?
Document everything. And I mean everything. Take photos of any damage. Write down detailed notes of every conversation you have with the insurance company. Keep copies of all emails and letters. Create a paper trail, That way, if you have to dispute something later, you've got the evidence.
So basically become like a super organized record keeper.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to ask questions. If something doesn't sound right, if you don't understand something, if they're giving you the runaround, push back. Remember, you're the customer. You're the one paying for this service.
That's a good point. It's easy to forget that sometimes. It feels like they have all the power and we're just, at their mercy.
Feinman really emphasizes that it shouldn't be that way. He reminds us that insurance is a service we've paid for. We have a right to clear explanations, to fair treatment.
Yeah.
We shouldn't be afraid to demand that.
I like that. Demand it. But what if you're doing all that and you're still hitting a wall? What if they're just not budging?
That's when you might need to consider getting some professional help. For complex claims, or claims that involve a lot of money, a lawyer or a public adjuster can be a game changer.
Okay, so it's like having someone in your corner who knows how to fight the system.
Exactly. They know the ins and outs of the industry. They can advocate for you effectively. It can make a huge difference.
That's good to know. But I have to ask, doesn't all this, the documentation, the lawyers, the potential for court battles, doesn't it all just take a ton of time? Like, who has time for that?
It's a valid concern. Feinman acknowledges that the process can be a real drain on your time and energy, but he also makes the point that it's an investment, especially when there's a lot at stake. Imagine you had a major loss, like a house fire, a serious injury, and the insurance company offers you a settlement that's, pennies on the dollar.
In that case, it seems like fighting back, even if it takes time, would be worth it.
Right, and you're not just fighting for yourself, you're contributing to a larger push for accountability in the industry. The more people who stand up for their rights, the more pressure there is for things to change.
Okay, so be informed, document everything, be persistent. Anything else?
One more thing. Feinman talks about how important it is to understand how insurance companies segment claims.
Segmented. What does that mean?
Basically, it means knowing how they categorize different types of claims. Remember we talked about MIMEST claims earlier?
Yeah, those whiplash claims.
Right. Those are treated differently than, say, a claim for a house fire. They have different approaches, different tactics.
So they have different playbooks depending on the type of claim.
You could say that. And knowing what their playbook is can really help you anticipate their moves and prepare your own strategy.
It's starting to sound like we're playing chess here.
It can feel that way. And that's why Feinman emphasizes the importance of being strategic, thinking ahead, anticipating their moves, and not letting them control the game. And he also talks a lot about the psychological aspects of dealing with insurance companies.
What do you mean?
Well, they often use tactics that are specifically designed to wear you down, to make you feel like it's not worth fighting. They delay, they deny, they complicate things. But it's important to remember they're not invincible.
So it's like a battle of wills almost.
Yeah. Sometimes it feels that way. But by being informed, by being prepared, by being persistent, you can level the playing field. You can actually increase your chances of getting a fair outcome. And every time someone wins, every time the insurance company is held accountable, it sets a precedent for everyone else.
This has been really insightful. It's clear that Feynman's book is like required reading for anyone who's ever had to deal with insurance. But before we wrap up, I have one more question for you. If our listeners could walk away from this whole deep dive with just one piece of advice, the one thing that would help them avoid all these pitfalls that Feinman talks about, what would it be?
Ooh, that's a good one. I think if I had to boil it all down to one thing, it would be, don't underestimate the power of your own voice.
Interesting. What do you mean by that?
Well, think about it. The whole insurance industry, it often feels like this huge, faceless machine, right? They've got the lawyers, the money, all these procedures.
Yeah, you feel kind of helpless.
Exactly. It's easy to feel like you're up against this giant and that nothing you do is going to make a difference. But that's exactly what they want you to think.
So it's about overcoming that feeling of powerlessness.
Exactly. Don't let their size and complexity intimidate you. Because at the end of the day, it's still just people making decisions. And people can be influenced.
Okay, so how do we do that? How do we make our voices heard? We're not all lawyers or, expert negotiators.
It starts with something as simple as asking questions. Don't be afraid to challenge them, to ask for clarification, to push back when something doesn't seem right. You have a right to understand the process, and you have a right to demand fair treatment.
So it's about being assertive, not just being passive and accepting whatever they tell us.
Exactly. And it goes beyond just individual interactions, too. If you've had a bad experience with an insurance company, tell people about it. Write a review online, file a complaint with your state insurance department, connect with a consumer advocacy group. These things might seem small, but they can actually make a difference.
It's like a collective push for accountability.
Exactly. The more people who speak up, the harder it becomes for these companies to keep getting away with these tactics. And every time someone wins, every time an insurance company is held accountable, it sets a precedent that helps everyone else.
That's a good point. It makes it feel a little less hopeless,
And remember, knowledge is power, especially when it comes to insurance. Feinman's book is a great place to start, but there are tons of resources out there. Websites, books, articles. Take the time to learn about your policy, your rights, the tactics these companies use. The more you know, the better prepared you'll be to protect yourself.
This has been incredibly eye-opening. We started this deep dive feeling kind of overwhelmed by the whole insurance maze, but now I actually feel a little more empowered, like there are things we can do.
That's great to hear. That's exactly what Feinman was hoping to achieve with his book. He wants to give people the tools to fight back and create a fairer, more transparent insurance system for everyone.
Well, on that note, I want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive into delay, deny, defend. It's been a fascinating conversation and hopefully a really empowering one for our listeners.
The pleasure was all mine. And remember, folks, knowledge is power. Don't be afraid to use it.
And to our listeners, if you're feeling inspired, if you want to learn more, definitely pick up a copy of Feinman's book. It's essential reading for anyone who wants to understand the world of insurance and make it work for them.
And don't forget to share your own stories and thoughts in the comments below. Let's keep this conversation going and work together to make the insurance industry a little less daunting for everyone.